We've survived St. Patrick's Day and had our first taste of spring. Thanks to you all for coming today. To begin our meeting, we're going to have our invocation today delivered by Quester George Dodd.
Good morning. These words are from invocations given by the chaplain of the United States Senate, the Reverend Peter Marshall. May we be in prayer. Our Father, teach us that liberty and freedom are not only to be loved, but also to be lived. They cost too much to be hoarded, things too precious to be buried in books. Make us see that liberty and freedom do not confer the right to do as we please, but the opportunity to do what is right. As winter strives with spring along many city streets near and far, and so far in Ukraine, may our love go out to all who need encouragement, to all who lack food and clothing, to all who are cold and cheerless, to all who long for home and fellowship. Help us in our blessings to be more willing to share the good things of life. Give us generosity and concern for others. Amen.
Today's paper is presented by Steve Smith. Born and raised in Fort Wayne, Steve grew up in the Lafayette Place addition on the south side of Fort Wayne. Following his college education, Steve started his family with Ann Tudor and his business career in banking in Indianapolis. In 1983, Steve moved back to Fort Wayne with Ann and their two children, Adrian and Rachel. Steve is the retired CEO and treasurer of Allied Physicians, a multi-specialty medical group comprised of 34 physicians and 7 PhDs located here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. 7 professional divisions make up Allied Physicians, including neurology, neurosurgery, physiatry, neuropsychology, cardiovascular, thoracic surgery, colorectal surgery, and ENT. He has been associated with Allied Physicians since 1990, retiring in 2019. Steve concluded his 20-year banking career as a senior vice president of personal banking, shareholder relations, and marketing at Lincoln National Bank in Fort Wayne. In related business activities, he serves on the boards of Tri-State Medical Group, a Northeast Indiana independent practice association, Fort Wayne Medical Surety Corporation, a risk retention group, captive malpractice insurance company, Medical Informatics Engineering, a computer software and services company, the Better Business Bureau of Northern Indiana, and the United Way of Allen County, as well as a variety of nonprofit organizations in Allen County. In government service, Steve served on the Fort Wayne Plan Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the Economic Development Commission. He received a Bachelor of Science in Business at Indiana University, as well as an MBA, also from IU. He is a certified medical practice executive by the Medical Group Managers Association. Steve and his wife, Ann, reside at Sylvan Lake in Indiana and in Fort Wayne. He enjoys the company of his 2 daughters, as well as his 4 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Steve's paper today is on Art Smith, Fort Wayne's bird boy.
Well, from that introduction, you can tell that my wife likes to have me out of the house a lot. Art Smith is a great topic for us. We aren't related, but we all are part of the extended Smith family, and so on behalf of all the Smiths everywhere, we appreciate the selection committee for giving us this paper assignment. I first want to acknowledge the resources that helped me write the paper. The Allen County Public Library still does have Art Smith books in its collection. The History Center was very helpful and steered me to buy this book, which they sell, and if you really want to read all about Art Smith, that's a good piece to pick up. And our own Randy Harder, who seems to have a collection of information on historical topics of Fort Wayne about everything, was able to loan me some pieces. Well, probably most of you don't know a whole lot about Art Smith. After all, it was over 130 years ago that he was born, and would be coming up on the 100th anniversary of his death in a few years. But this story is the life of Art Smith, a story that mixes grit, determination, inventiveness, courage, and optimism. It also carries a good deal of romance, love, marriage, betrayal, and divorce over its short 36-year run. One kind of wonders how David Anspaugh, the famous Indiana movie producer, missed this great story. It's a shame that the story of Art Smith didn't make it into the movies. But what today do we know of Art Smith, even here in Fort Wayne, Art Smith's birthplace and his final resting place? Who now knows that Smith was one of the earliest pioneer aviators in America? Who now knows that Smith was nationally recognized as an aviation exhibitionist, by some regarded as the greatest aviator of his time? Who now knows that Smith, after gaining international fame, was sought after by the governments of Russia, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Japan at the outbreak of the First World War to consult and train their aviators in flying techniques that he had perfected in his many spectacular exhibitions all over the world? Who would rank Art Smith with the well-known aviators of the 20th century, such as Lindbergh, Earhart, Yeager, Shepard, Glenn, and Armstrong? Well, to America in the 1910s, till his death in 1926, Art Smith was their Neil Armstrong. But before we dig into the heart of the matter, let's set the stage and put us in a framework of considering what life was like in the earliest 20th century, 1890 to 1910 specifically. So set your imaginations to a course to the turn of the century, the 20th century. The Wright brothers made their first Kitty Hawk flights in 1903. This was the start of the aviation age in America. Henry Ford sold his first Model T car in 1908. Radio to the public was not available until 1920, until the Westinghouse Company opened their first radio station. Landline telephones first became generally available to residential homes around 1900. And by 1910, less than 25% of the homes in America were powered or illuminated by electricity. Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1910 had a population of about 69,000 people. Well, let's look at the early years, 1890 to 1909. It was 1890, and Robert and Ida Smith moved to Fort Wayne, purchasing a home on East Berry Street. 323 East Berry, this is now Midwest Pipe and Steel, was in the midst of a residential neighborhood at the time. Importantly, this home had no mortgage on it at the time of its purchase, which will be a key fact later. A historical marker stands near this address, but it pays tribute to Mother George, a Civil War nurse, not Art Smith's birthplace. As a boy, Art was charged with excitement by the Wright brothers' Kitty Hawk flights. He scrounged every article, magazine, or book that discussed flights, the design of airplanes, or the physical mechanics of flying. Just 2 years after these flights, Art announced to his parents that he would be an aviator. This was 1905, and he was just 15. By 1908, Art had finished his schooling at the Fort Wayne Central School and began work at the Weatherhog Architectural Company. He studied drafting and helped his father, who was a construction contractor, with contracts and design of projects. Gradually, his father's eyesight was going blind, and Art saw that he could use aviation prize money being awarded at the time to help get his dad to Chicago to help him with his eyesight. On a family outing to Lake James, although in Art Smith's biography it's called James Lake, and he and his girlfriend, Amy Coor, were floating in a rowboat on a lake when Art observed a large bird in flight. Probably a turkey buzzer, but it was big enough that Art was able to watch how it used its wings and tail feathers to stay aloft. It was 1908, and Art told Amy that he would design and build an airplane and fly it within a year. Now, we recognize that Art had never seen an airplane other than a picture of one. Initially, Art's parents weren't very receptive to the aviator idea, encouraging Art to continue his work at the architectural company and become an apprentice architect. But after many discussions and reflections, they told Art that he should go for it, and his parents agreed to take a $1,800 mortgage, which is about $25,000 today, out on their home to fund the construction of the plane. And Mr. Smith, good old dad, had 1 year to pay it off. The mortgage, 1910. Art Smith was known as a kid with a glowing smile. He was short, but wiry strong. Most people in those years did not go to college, and Art was no exception. He didn't smoke or drink because he wanted to keep his nerves steady. Art was desperate to help his father before his vision left him entirely. The first plane was finished in January 1910. Contrary to the Wright design, it featured a stabilizer at the front and the rear of the plane. It was a Curtiss type a biplane with a 40 horsepower motor. Called a pusher plane, the motor actually sat behind the pilot. Zooming up and down uncontrollably on the first flight, it crashed shortly after takeoff. Everything except the motor was smashed to bits. Luckily, Art was thrown clear of the wreck and was largely unhurt. Undaunted by the setback, Art commenced work on the new design for his second plane. Only 6 months remained before the bank loan was due. Work continued in the barn behind the Smith residence, and spending 16 hours a day, the new plane was completed in just 6 months. Unfortunately, no prize money had been won by that time, and the bank foreclosed on the home. Mrs. Smith left to move in with her sister, where Art and his father moved into the barn under an agreement with the bank. So Mr. Kerr, Amy's father, was never much in favor at that time of Art as a potential son-in-law, as aviators were considered daredevil fools, and he now forbade Amy from seeing Art. As luck would have it, some of the Curtiss aviation flyers were in Fort Wayne to demonstrate their plane. This afforded Art for the first time to actually see airplanes in person and talk to pilots. And he convinced one of them to come to the barn to see the airplane. The Curtiss flyer told him there's no way this plane will ever get off the ground. The smash-up kid, convinced that the plane could fly, Art felt it was time to test it at high altitudes. Although throughout Fort Wayne, there was common knowledge of Art was up to at the driving park. The driving park was an old race course out north of town, so far north it was just north of State Boulevard, which was the city limits at that time. So we had to get the plane was ready to go and did short hops, takeoffs, and landings. But for the high altitude flight, a grand crowd came out to the park. More bad luck ensued as the plane never got off the ground. Not to be daunted and urgently needing money for parts, Art and his team set up a tent in the driving park to exhibit the plane. Each person was charged 25 cents to see the plane, talk to the pilot. A replica of this plane, design number 3, hangs in the passenger terminal at Fort Wayne International Airport. And you can see the radiator, the engine, and the gas tank are all behind the pilot. Now that's the motivation to bring the plane down safe, if I've ever heard of one. How many of you have been to the airport and had no idea what this was, other than it's a biplane? It's Art Smith's plane. Using money raised from the show, Art and his mechanic hopped a freight train on the Wabash line to Chicago. Traveling in an empty boxcar, they reached Chicago in about 10 hours. The Chicago School of Aviation was offering flight instructions, but the cost was too high. At the Hawthorne racetrack, many planes were stored there so Art could talk to other aviators and study their planes. With lots of new ideas, the pair hoboed back to Fort Wayne. Another bank loan was necessary, and this one was secured by 3 lots his parents owned in the outskirts of town. Work began immediately on design number 3, with an estimated 6 weeks to get the modifications completed. The loan was a 90-day loan, and Scientific American was offering a $1,000 prize in a race about 2 months away. Once the modifications were complete, a 6-mile flight to New Haven and back was planned. New Haven now at that time was about 8 miles away. The town newspapers played this up, and a huge crowd assembled to witness the long-distance test. The day of the test, Art and his crew were out of gas, literally. His hat had to be passed around the driving park to get enough money to buy the gas. As the crowd held its breath, the plane took off. The flight was smooth and stable, but over 500 feet in the air, Art was on his way to New Haven when the engine stopped. Fortunately, Art could glide the plane back to Earth and land in a field. A coolant tube to the radiator had broken and overheating the engine, seizing it up. He made a quick repair and took off again on the way to New Haven. Upon landing back in Fort Wayne, the crowd stormed the field, surrounded Art and Amy, and cheered their heads off. To pay off the bank loan, the managers of the driving park planned an exhibition, generously allowing Art to keep 100% of the gate receipts. It was noted that a boy like Art Smith is a credit to Fort Wayne. A printer donated posters and tickets. The local newspapers provided plenty of gratis publicity. A streetcar company ran extra cars out to the park, and hats were thrown in the air when Amy and Art showed up in a limousine. The Bird Boy, 1910. Art and Al Wertman worked all night to get the plane ready to go. The night before, it rained. Would this be more bad luck? The rain stopped by Saturday morning. There was no margin of error. The bank loan was due Monday. By 2 p.m., a large crowd had gathered, and the enthusiasm was high. Again, the plane was off the ground smoothly and stably. With some high winds, Art had to fly the plane higher and higher to the point where his hands grew numb. Fighting the currents all the way, Art landed safely, and the crowd went nuts, and Mrs. Smith fainted. A total of 4 flights over 3 days were planned, and the gate receipts totaled just under $600. Monday morning, the loan was paid. Friends who had loaned him money were repaid. Art bought Al a new pair of pants at the town's best store. Guess where that was? Wolf and Dessars. This week, one of the newspapers coined the phrase that would stay with Art the rest of his career, Fort Wayne's Bird Boy. Art's goals were simple at this time. Win aviation prizes, take his dad to the oculist, which is what ophthalmic physicians at the time, I guess, were called, buy his parents' house back, and marry Amy. Mills Aviation of Chicago approached Art to contract with him for a series of flights in the Midwest and the Mid-South. 2 of these were in Texas. Art and his plane were on the way to Texas. At the next stop, in each stop, there was a crash. However, the second crash destroyed the plane, everything except the motor. Art had to put the motor back on the plane, head back to Fort Wayne, and Art was broke. 1911, Midwestern flights. Back in Fort Wayne, Art's parents were supportive, but he needed serious financial backing. Appeal after appeal proved not productive, as no one would lend him a dime. Only his parents and Amy believed in him. Finally, Senator Stephen Fleming, a wealthy business person, agreed to see him. Fleming was an influential state senator at the time and was the owner of the Wholesome Baking Company, still exists. A sports and race car enthusiast, Fleming agreed to a long-term loan unsecured of $3,000. Art headed to Chicago with the money in his engines, vowing not to return until he could take his father to the doctor, replace his parents' home, and buy an engagement ring. Once the plane was repaired, flights were scheduled in exhibits in Indiana and Illinois. In Beresford, Illinois, over 25,000 people showed up. 2 flights went off as planned. The crowd cheered wildly for 15 minutes when Art landed, and he collected $750. To new heights, 1912. With $750 in his pocket, Art could take his father to the oculist and buy Amy that ring. Working on the motor, he found that most of the bearings were shot. Other mechanics would not even believe that the plane could fly at all. A new 60 horsepower motor would cost $1,650. Trying to strike a deal with Mills, Art got them to lend him the engine for $900 in future payments. Talk about a leap of faith. Art wired his dad and told him to come to Chicago. Sadly, on examining Mr. Smith's eyes, the oculist determined that nothing could be done. Mr. Smith never voiced a complaint and left for home anticipating what would become of his vision. The next season ticked off with an exhibit in Elkhart, Indiana. Being so close to Fort Wayne, Mrs. Smith and Amy came up to see it. With the new motor on the plane, the plane leaped into the air. He stayed in the air that day for over an hour. Exhibits went extraordinarily well with no crashes reported this season. Between Hillsdale and Adrian, Michigan, Art even dropped leaflets and newspapers on each little town he passed promoting his next exhibit. Pressing new limits, he took flights up to 5,000 feet, enabling him to see the curvature of the Earth for the first time. This is the first recorded seeing of the curvature of the Earth. Under a new contract with Mills, Art shipped the plane to Deadwood, South Dakota. Art arrived in Deadwood to a hero's welcome. A town car of dignitaries were parked next to the train depot awaiting the arrival. Art was put up in a suite at a hotel. The bird boy of Fort Wayne no longer needed an introduction. Not on Calhoun Street. With his success on the season's tour, Art could pay off the balance of his motor bill to Mills Aviation. Each exhibit was netting him $300 to $500, equivalent to about $7,000 today in today's money. By this time, Art had been in over 60 crashes. His last stop that year was back in Fort Wayne, where he proposed marriage to Amy Coor. He bought the biggest diamond ring that the jeweler had to offer. You remember Baber Jewelers on Calhoun Street? You might have bought your ring there. He gave it to her outside the jeweler's store right on Calhoun Street. Amy could only explain, "Oh no, Art, not on Calhoun Street." With one last exhibit in West Virginia, Art was done for the season. He had money in the bank, new clothes, he paid off Senator Fleming, and now it was time to speak to Mr. Coor about the permission for the marriage. The plot thickens. As they got off the ground, or I skipped something, excuse me. So it was time to discuss the marriage. That afternoon at the driving park, he took Amy aloft as a passenger. As they got off the ground, Mr. and Mrs. Coor came racing across the field to try to stop them. While the flight was perfect, the Coors were furious. Mr. Coor took Amy home, forbade Art from seeing her, and made plans to ship her off to the East Coast to a boarding school. Art did tell him that they were engaged, but Mr. Coor erupted, telling Art, "You are too young, too dangerous, and no marriage will be considered." Art gave a final performance for the local fans for free. Each flight over 3 days went off perfectly. He did dips, spirals, and volplaning. Volplaning is turning the engine off and gliding the plane down to the ground. Each time the crowd went nuts. Hats were thrown in the air. Art and Amy were carried off the field on the shoulders of the crowd. As the plane was being taken down for storage, Art told the boys, "I'll need it tomorrow." Guess what? The elopement, 1912. Now, you know about the elopement, right? You told me about that. The Coor family would not let Art see Amy. Amy did get the word to Art that she was leaving at the end of the week to go east to live with an aunt and finish school there. Art decided that they would elope to Michigan, a state that did not require a parent's signature or consent for marriages of a person younger than 19. With her train ticket to New York already purchased, time was of the essence. The next morning, work began to prepare the plane to accommodate a passenger and a modest amount of luggage. Hillsdale was their destination, as Art had landed at the college there before. The Coors had agents watching the train station of the GR&I to thwart the elopement. Now, the GR&I is the Pufferbelly Trail now, going north to Hillsdale. Near Huntertown, the engine began to miss. Art had to land picking a meadow near a farm. One of the valves was broken. Determined to follow through on their plan, Art called his mechanic Al, and within an hour, a new valve was at the farm. Upon the repairs, they were off on the ground. En route, they flew over Lake James, where Art had that epiphany experience of knowing that one day he would become an aviator. Along the way north, telegraph operators observed their flight and shot back messages to Fort Wayne tracking their passage. At the last 55 miles of the flight were covered in just under an hour, an aviation record at that time of a mile a minute. As they approached Hillsdale College, a campus that Art had landed on there before, one of the ailerons was not working. Coming down fast, Art did his best to keep the plane level, but short of the landing field, the plane flipped over and crashed. Art and Amy were thrown free. As they approached, a party of well-wishers had gathered to see them. As they rushed to the crash scene, they were terrified that the couple was dead. With no hospital in Hillsdale at that time, they were taken to the hotel with the doctor summoned. 4 hours later, Art regains consciousness. Amy was in a room down the hall, wrapped in bandages and white as a sheet. When they saw each other, they smiled and cried. And someone asked if they were still wanted to proceed with their marriage, to which they affirmed they did. Reverend C.E. Thomas, a Presbyterian minister, was summoned. The attending physician and his nurse served as the witnesses, and at 11 p.m. that night, Art and Amy Smith were married. As the service was concluding, in walked Amy's father, mother, and Art's mother. But everyone was so relieved that their children were alive that they were overcome with emotion, and the objections were ruled out. The citizens of Hillsdale were so thrilled that the Smiths had chosen their town for their event that a no was not accepted on a grand celebration. Newspapers around the country carried the story that Art Smith, the famous stunt pilot from Fort Wayne, Indiana, had used his airplane to elope and marry. It was October 28, 1912. Art was 22, Amy was 18. Amy exclaimed when she saw her parents, "Oh, Papa, we're married. Please don't be cross." Most of the nation was sympathetic to the Coor family, however, because of the many times that Art had crashed his planes. Ever to know the value of publicity, Art had the ceremony reenacted and filmed, and postcards were sold all over America with this scene. So 1913, the hometown celebrity. A week later, the Fort Wayne community came together at the Temple Theater, later known as the Palace. Some of you maybe remember that on Washington Boulevard, for a formal medal presentation. It seemed that the whole population of the town was on hand on the streets outside the theater as Amy was carried in on a stretcher. Later, Arthur shared, "It was the proudest moment of my life." But back to business. Expenses of their medical treatment had eaten up Art's savings, and Art needed to make money right away. Looping the loop had never been accomplished in America at this time. Art needed a better plane for fancy flying, and all winter, Art and his team worked on building a stronger plane that could stand up to the rigors that advanced flying required. In the spring of 1913, Art and Amy set out on a new expedition across America. Everything went great, no crashes, good success. Art continued to pester Amy in regards to getting an authorization to proceed with his dream. By now, a Frenchman, Adolphe Regard, had accomplished the feat in Europe. Art became determined to master the trick or die trying. Again, Amy said no. Finally, later in the season, Amy felt that Art could be trusted to keep his word that the plane and the trick were safe. Art didn't waste, so she gave her permission, and Art didn't waste a moment in finishing his work on a new plane. Equally important, he continued his studies in aerodynamic principles. Art knew from his near-fatal crashes that the rudder was the key to a safe flight, and once the plane was finished, he accomplished the loop-de-loop on the first attempt. Art was booked for aerobatic flying exhibits throughout the summer. Wiley Post, a 15-year-old Oklahoma boy, witnessed one of Art's shows and vowed to become an aviator. Now completely free of financial worries, the summer was a blur of success. He bought a gift speedster automobile for Amy, and he bought his parents a new home on Bass Road. This house still stands, and it was originally purchased with a 10-acre plot. Fame and fortune, 1914 and 15. Art was a national hero by 1915. Newspapers across the country routinely carried stories about his exhibitions, his tours, his medals, and his honors. They also featured his opinions on aviation, its practical application, and technology. Recall that at the time there was a national debate about the USA entering the European War or not. Gee, does that sound familiar? Smith was a great advocate of military preparedness, particularly using aviation. Touted as intrepid, a daredevil, and an innovator as an aviator, people flocked to see his flying exhibitions. His glowing smile and youthful charm projected a great can't-lose image. Reporters loved to talk to him, take his picture, and quote him in the press. Art could play the role of the talkative and friendly everyman fellow to a T. Without question, Art Smith was the sensation of the decade in the 1910s. People who had witnessed the flights of both Smith and Lincoln Beechey declared Art to be the greatest aviator in America. Next, 1915, the San Francisco World's Fair exhibit. The World's Fair was being held in San Francisco to commemorate the opening of the Panama Canal and the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the Pacific Ocean. Opening in February, the signature structure of the fair was the Tower of Jewels, standing 43 stories tall. And this is the Tower of Jewels, fully illuminated at night, which was also a unique feature. So that would be about twice the height of the Lincoln Tower. Lincoln Beechey, the most popular aviator of the day, was to be a featured attraction. Unfortunately, Beechey crashed his plane in the bay and drowned before the fair opened. Smith was one of 3 American aviators who could loop the loop and was invited to San Francisco to audition. His flying was spectacular. It said that he out-Beechey'd Beechey. Here he incorporated an illuminated plane with lit phosphorus flaming torches. Fireworks shot out of the back of the plane, and his show each night featured a flight at night, something that Art was the first to demonstrate. Art also used skywriting in his flights, also a first. The Panama, Pacific, and International Exhibition had a new star, the Bird Boy of Fort Wayne. While performing at the expo, Art penned his autobiography, The Story of Art Smith. It was serialized by the San Francisco Bulletin and carried by newspapers across the country. In Fort Wayne, the News Sentinel published the series in full. It was a story of grit, determination, and true love conquering all. Night after night, all attention was trained on the skies to see the Bird Boy of Fort Wayne deliver a thrilling performance. Newspapers across the country ran picture after picture of Art's stunts and death-defying displays. Foreign governments now began paying attention to Art and his skills. Aviation began to come in, or invitations began to come in from all over the world for Art to be a consultant, pilot trainer, and to those nations embroiled in World War I. Requests were made for Art to come, visit, perform, and perhaps join their Air Force. The invitations include the governments of Russia, Germany, Italy, France, and Great Britain. For 4 months, Art's aerobatics captivated the PPIE's crowd. The photographer in Oakland captured a time-release image of his plane using a line of fire. The plane, coming from the plane as he repeated loops and dives, and that's this picture. This picture was printed all over the world. A toast of the town, now Art began to experience problems that he could never have imagined. Women admirers flocked to be around him, to dine with him, to dance with him at the party of the week. His name would be linked in gossip columns to many of them. Some asked to fly with Art. Art always disappointed them, as he took his mother up instead. A celebrity in Japan, 1916. While performing at the PPIE, Art became acquainted with many Japanese dignitaries. On one flight over San Francisco Bay, he carried a Japanese flag in honor of the new Mikado, who was ascending to the throne the next day. A new relationship occurred between Art and the Japanese people. Hoping to preempt other world powers, Japan offered Art a fee of $10,000 plus all expenses paid for a series of flights. At that time of Japan's offer was pending, Art and Amy's marriage had reached a breaking point. In December 1915, she departed California alone by train to Fort Wayne. News of the separation was carried in newspapers all over the country, much as we'd seen with the divorce of Brad and Angelina in our time. Art filed the papers for divorce in California and set sail for Japan the next day. Money from the tour was a tremendous success, a triumph. Money from the tour was wired back to San Francisco, where Art purchased a new automobile to be shipped back to his parents. Sadly, the tour was cut short when a strong wind caused the plane to crash. Art's leg was broken in the crash. Surgical repairs to his leg would come to haunt Art later in life, as it caused one leg to be somewhat shorter than the other. The scandal. News of the Smith divorce dominated the press throughout the country. Ugly accusations were made on both sides. Art, well known for his love of dancing and partying, was played up as links to women in his company. Art countersued in the divorce, Amy countersued in the divorce, seeking an equal distribution of Art's property. In response, Art named 4 men as recipients of Amy's affections. Copies of her love letters to each found their way into the press, further enlarging the scandal. In the end, a settlement was paid to Amy of just $1,000. A second tour of Japan was planned, as Art had promised. All the aviators who participated with Smith in the PPIE, or the 1916 triumphant tour of Japan, were now dead. Beechey, Niles, Christopherson, and most recently Pagliarosi had perished in flight. Art, accompanied by his mother along with the mechanics and the drivers for his race cars, departed for Japan in February 1917, the day his divorce was final. By the fall of 1917, it was time for Art to return to America. With his contracts fulfilled, he headed home, and by this time, the world had been at war for 3 years. Use of planes and the feared aces who piloted them abounded. But with America still neutral, Art did not yet have a role to play. World War I and military preparedness. In each of his years as an aviation hero, Art spoke frequently and at great length about the importance of military preparedness and pilot training. Upon his return to the States, Art became more outspoken than ever. As mentioned earlier in this paper, most of the governments involved in the World War sought out Art as a consultant and a plane designer or pilot trainer. Art pledged to use all his skill for America. When America did enter the war in April 1917, Art did try to enlist in the Army Air Corps. He was refused, presumably due to his short stature, his disability, and his military crashes. Art was offered his many crashes. Art was offered an appointment to train, test, and evaluate pilots, and he was stationed at Langley Field in Virginia, but he never stopped petitioning the Army Air Corps to allow him to have a more active role. Tellingly now, the press now paid much more attention to the fighting pilots who were becoming aces. The notoriety of Art Smith began to fade from the public view. Between 1917 and 1920, Art served as an aviation instructor, pilot evaluator, and a consultant on the design of planes. It perturbed Art that the aviation records for speed and endurance were held by foreigners. He believed that a lack of U.S. government support was holding American flyers back. At the outbreak of the war, he observed that France had more than 2,500 trained pilots and America had less than 200. He discussed this personally with President Roosevelt and President Wilson. The U.S. Mail Service and Ohio Lights, 1926. After the war and after so many experiences of seeing Army pilots in flight, America was much less interested in exhibitions of stunt flying. Art had first used smoke and other chemicals to write in the sky, and advertisers were now keen to promote their goods and services in municipal areas to the public. What better way than to have your name or your brand emblazing the sky above your city? Art Smith and other pilots continued to make their living now by flying through contracts to write in the sky. Also, after the war, the Post Office Department made plans to bring begin night flying of mail on a transcontinental basis in 1921. Experienced pilots were needed, and Art was a natural candidate. His appointment, effective April 1st, 1923, was assigned the Chicago to Cleveland route. The planes had to be modified from an open cockpit to a closed cockpit, which Smith designed. A heater designed by Art was used to keep the pilot from freezing using the exhaust of the engine. Flight instruments were not available at the time, and Smith wore a rudimentary altimeter. In the early days, Art became acquainted with Charles Lindbergh, who will feature in our story later, also an air mail pilot. Art would depart Chicago in the early evening, fly to Bryan, Ohio, grab a few hours sleep, then fly on to Cleveland, arriving in dawn. That evening, the route would be repeated in reverse. As an advancement engineered by Art, the Bryan field was illuminated. On February the 12th, 1926, the weather was cold and foggy. Gee, what a surprise. So Art encountered icy conditions near Waterloo, Indiana. It is presumed that these conditions caused Art to drift off course. Speculation suggests that Art mistook the lights of a farm for that of the Bryan airfield. In a pass over the farm, Art hit some trees in a nearby woods. The plane, heavy with ice, would not rise on his command and crashed through the trees. The plane landed upside down, pinning Art underneath it. The fuel ignited with flames too intense to permit rescue. It would be several hours before the fire died down to permit the removal of Art's remains. A shockwave went through the community, the aviation community, the nation, and the world. The bird boy, representing adventure and success to so many people, was dead. He was just 36. Mrs. Ida Smith was stricken with grief as well. At first, she opposed any public funeral, but she grieved in her small Cleveland home, surrounded by Art's awards, medals, and cups given to honor her son, the conqueror of the air. After some consolation by friends, it was persuaded to allow a public funeral. An announcement was printed in the nation's newspapers, quote, "All persons who wish to join in paying public tribute to the famous bird boy are invited to meet the nickel plate train at the Calhoun Street Station in Fort Wayne at noon and follow the body to the cemetery. Friends are welcome as a service at the grave in Lindenwood Cemetery." Tributes, 1926 to 1928. A devout Christian Scientist, his adult life, his minister accompanied his parents from Cleveland to Fort Wayne to take charge of the services. Men who shared Art's love of aviation and served as his mechanics, business associates, and friends met the train and served as pallbearers. People from around the world observing the news and responded with telegrams saluting Smith and his accomplishments. The Emperor of Japan sent a personal message to the family, as did President Roosevelt. Orville Wright expressed his sympathies to Art's family with a message. On the morning of the service, the train was met at the station by a crowd of thousands, led by Mayor Gerke and Postmaster Balls. Post office officials in their gray official uniform made an honor guard to accompany the casket. Citizens lined the streets from the station to Lindenwood Cemetery, men doffing their hats and women in tears as the bier passed by. As the entourage of the casket and the mourners approached the grave, 2 planes from McCook Field flew overhead, circled the grave, and dropped flowers. One dropped a floral bouquet that landed on the coffin as to connect the grave with the plane. At the hour of the interment, the Air Service inaugurated a new postal route named for Art from Chicago to Detroit, with the first flight taking off as Smith was put to rest. Within days, community leaders agreed that a permanent memorial needed to be created to honor Smith. Judge Charles Ryan proclaimed, quote, "Art Smith is one of the most outstanding citizens that Fort Wayne has given to the world. No single flyer has contributed more to the aviation than he did. The whole world is in his debt," end quote. City leaders agreed that they must erect a monument to show the boys and girls of the future that Fort Wayne produced a real hero in Art Smith. February the 18th, the Journal-Gazette announced the formation of a Smith Memorial Campaign. Each day, the paper printed the names and the amounts of the donations. Can you imagine that today? Retail stores, factories, and fraternal organizations launched fundraising programs. Donations poured in from all over the country and all over the world. In New York, sculptor James Novelli was selected to execute the piece. Entitled The Spirit of Flight, atop a 40-foot pillar of granite is a bronze statue of a young man, a boy, with wings and a flying helmet looking upward, his feet barely touching the small globe. At the base of the statue are 4 plaques, each depicting a different stage of mail transportation. The figure is in bronze and is 8 feet high. At its base is inscribed, quote, erected in memory of Arthur R. Smith, 1890 to 1926, pioneer aviator who gave his life in the U.S. mail service by the citizens of Fort Wayne. Art Smith, captured in bronze, would forever be Fort Wayne's bird boy. 1 year later, Fort Wayne was ready to unveil and dedicate a permanent memorial to Art Smith. August the 15th, 1928, at Memorial Park, Ida Smith pulled the cord to reveal the bronze and granite memorial erected to her son's memory. 3 Army planes from Wright Field in Dayton flew overhead and precisely then dropped, sending flowers down on the assembled crowd. And this, to this day, is the tallest monument in the state of Indiana that honors an individual. Smithfield and beyond, to conclude. Overall, Smith received 58 medals in his career. Throughout the ensuing years, there were memorials held, honors and gestures of remembrance. The most significant of these was the naming of Fort Wayne Municipal Airport in Smith's honor. Originally named in honor of World War I ace pilot Paul Bear, that name was transferred to the new military training field being built south of the city in the 1930s. Over the protest of many citizens and aviators, the airport authority vowed to close Smithfield in 1920, converting it to private use. In December 1930, the airmail service launched a route between Fort Wayne and South Bend, with the inaugural flight dropping a wreath on Smith's memorial at Memorial Park. In 1956, the News Sentinel began a serial reprint of Art's autobiography, awakening memories and interest in Smith and his accomplishments. As late as 1970, a national fan club was named in his honor, the Art Smith Aeroplane Society. The OX5 Club, which I learned at the table today is the name of an engine from that time, constructed a full-scale replica of Smith's first successful plane, which hangs in the passenger boarding area today. This project took 5 years to complete compared to the 6 months it took Al and Art. By the 50th anniversary of his death, the memory of Art Smith had slipped into legend, largely forgotten by the general public. The aviators who grew to fame were those aces of World War I and World War II. Later, the space program fostered another generation of heroes and their unforgettable accomplishments. What a pioneer pilot did by building and flying his own plane seems tame compared to the exploits and accomplishments of flying to the moon. Art Smith's enthusiasm for flying even yet speaks of American entrepreneurship and adventure. A nation embroiled in aviation was on a grand adventure in the early days of the new century. The newness, the unknown, the danger all contributed to a glowing love affair America developed for flying. Art caught this wind in more ways than one. He was a fun-loving movie star and an international celebrity. He was loyal to his family and his friends. He was a devoted Christian Scientist who spread the world and his church's doctrines. Art Smith was a happy man, and I still think he'd make a darn fine movie. Thank you for your attention.